What's going on, everybody? It's Smiley's Garden. We're here for the organic takeover. I'm really excited to have Bryant Mason, the soil doctor, back for another round of questioning. How you doing, Bryant?
Doing well. Yeah, having a good night.
That's good, man. I'm excited. So we were chatting a little bit here. We were running a little behind with some internet problems, but we got it going, and that's a good thing, you know. So just to kind of give you a quick shout out, Bryant is, for anybody that doesn't know, is a certified soil agronomist specializing in organic amendments, right? And he's been doing that for a few years. That's his full-time career. So pretty awesome that you join us to share some stuff. And if anybody wants to reach out to Brian, he does soil recommendations on the daily and has done quite a few for me. And you can find all that at soildoctorconsulting.com. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Cool. So anybody wanting to reach out, but just to kind of start things off, Brian, I wanted to kind of dig in. There were some questions people in chat were and on Instagram were, once they heard you were coming on, were kind of hitting me up with some questions. And
oh, cool.
And a lot of them seem to be around you know, for smaller growers, people with a tent in the basement, or maybe like a 4x4 type bed, you know, they got a yard or two of soil total. What would be the optimal strategy that you would suggest for pulling sample out of that? So say they got a number of like number 10 pots and a number of number 1 pots for small ones. And what times in the cycle would you recommend trying to get testing going?
Great questions. The goal should be to minimize the number of tests that you take every single time you test, because they're all $55 is the lab fee. If you pay me to analyze it, it's another $40. So the general rule of thumb is to minimize the number of tests you take and then maximize the frequency in which you test. So a common mistake is, breaking an operation into, or like testing every single pot separately or every bed separately. The only reason you'd want to do that is if they're wildly different soil mixes from different companies that have been treated differently. So if you have a tent that has 4 pots or 8 pots or whatever, I would say you want 1 soil test. So I would pull like 2 samples from each pot and I'd mix it all together in a bucket. And then you take 2 cups of soil from that aggregate sample in the bucket, and that's what you send off to the laboratory. So as long as you got all the same soil to begin with, it's been grown in for a similar amount of time, the results are similar across your pots, 1 test is all you need. In terms of timing, and by the way, you want to, let me also say, you want to test your 1 or 3 gallon pots separate than your 15s or 25s or 30s, whatever you're using for a few weeks of veg flipped into flower, and whatever you're finishing your plants in, you want to test it separate, because those pot sizes are going to have much different nutrient levels just based on the plant root uptake and things. So I guess 2 separate tests on the 2 different, early veg and flower. The timing is essentially depends on the operation. If you're trying to flip your plants next day, so commercial operations I work with, like they're replanting next day because they have tight schedules. So you would want to pull the soil sample at least, if just bare minimum would be 2 weeks before harvest, because it takes about, 3 to 5 days in the mail, and then it takes the lab 5 days once it receives the soil sample, and it takes me 24 hours to turn a soil recommendation. So I just say 2 weeks to leave enough time to get the amendments in and get prepared and make that replant amendment. Otherwise, if you're a home grower, I'd say you just, the most important thing is to test after you harvest, because that determines your pre-plant soil amendment, which is really important. And so if you're a grower who's a little bit more serious and wants a little bit more precision through the entire cycle, I'd say take 2 tests. First one again after harvest, second one in veg before flower. I think that's a really good time where you can still make adjustments. You can still make a major influence on your final yield and quality. And then for the most serious growers who are either very, very data driven or can justify it economically, every 2 weeks. And once you're testing, so it's kind of like test once or twice. And then the next level, the next thing I would say is take a tissue test in veg immediately before flower with that soil test. And then if you've taken, if you want to go even further, I would say do a tissue test and a soil test every 2 weeks through the entire cycle.
Wow. All right. That'd be getting real serious.
That was fairly thorough. Right? I apologize.
No, I mean, it's good to know. And the times where you've seen guys doing them every other week like that, I mean, are there major course corrections that are getting made and things being found in a 2 week period, or is that kind of? No,
these are commercial growers who can justify it. I mean, they have massive rooms, and it wouldn't make sense for a home grower to do that. No, it's more, there's 2 reasons you do that. One is for the data. So you can see the nutrient dynamics graphically. I mean, you can just see how it changes every 2 weeks through the entire cycle. You can start to see, because there's also something interesting on tissue where the tissue numbers change because the plant is translocating nutrients fairly significantly.
Okay.
And so you'll see, it depends on what part of the plant you're sampling, but you'll see changes, and you can graph that change, and the rate at which it changes tells you a lot about your final yield potential. So there's a lot of like data analysis reasons to do it. But the other reason would just be that you want to see if your applications are working. So you get a recommendation, you're going to tweak something. You're going to drench a little bit of manganese sulfate and maybe some liquid nitrogen or something. And then you take a test 2 weeks later to see how it affected the soil and how it affected the plant, and if you need to keep going or if you need to pull back. So yeah, I mean, it's just sort of guiding nutrient management decisions, but there's no radical changes that are taking place. Usually the radical changes happen when you're doing your pre-plant amendments, where things are really deficient and you're making, pretty significant applications. But otherwise it's just a little more of this, a little less of this, that type of thing.
Gotcha. Well, that kind of rolls into the other question that I had been asked to ask you is, so in the case where we've harvested some pots and say a number of them, we sent in a soil recommendation and we got it back. What's the best way to add those amendments? Would it be best to try to empty all the pots onto a tarp, dig out all the root balls, put it all in, mix it all together, and then refill the pots? Or are we good with just trying to top dress that amendment in? Is there a real significant difference there?
There's definitely a significant difference. There's a lot of growers are hesitant to dump their soil. One, it's, potentially a lot more work and labor, but it's also, you're potentially damaging biological organisms that have, especially like fungal, mycelial webs and things like they're sensitive. So if you dump it, it destroys everything. That's kind of the theory, at least in my head, why you wouldn't want to dump pots. But the reality, and this is just sort of my approach, is that let's just say your pot, I think of a small pot as 10 gallons and a big pot as 30. So let's say you're growing in small pots, like 10, 15, 20 gallons through the entire cycle, and you're doing it organically and you're trying to reuse your soil over and over again. It's just such a nutrient intensive way to grow compared with, let's just use like my farm. It's 3 acres of diversified perennial orchard. That is a highly biological system, and it's not an aggressive, like nutrient intensive system. It's all about nutrient cycling. So I want my leaves and branches and wood chips and prunings and grasses and clovers to cycle and essentially to stimulate biology that cycles the nutrients through the system. And I do obviously manage nutrition and make amendments, spread minerals, but that would be problematic. If I were to take all the soil in my outdoor orchard and like totally disturb it, it would screw up the system.
Right.
But in a 10 to 15 gallon pot, that's not a natural ecological system. That's very close to sort of a quasi hydro system in which the nutrient intensity is so high that I believe in a small pot, you want to dump it out and get nutrients homogeneously mixed in that soil profile, because the plants are going to need the right concentration, the right sufficiency of nutrients in the right balance in as much of that soil as possible. And so to me, top dressing doesn't cut it if you're reusing your soil over and over again. That may change if people are in big beds or in huge pots and they have this really healthy biological ecosystem that they've been building for 10 or 20 cycles with compost and mulch and all kinds of stuff. I would be more hesitant if they're seeing really, really good biology and they're seeing fungal hyphae in the soil, I would be way more hesitant to dump that and destroy all of that. But in small pots, indoors, I'm all about amend the entire soil profile. Don't worry about disturbance.
I get kind of what you're saying too, because based on the volume of soil and the amount of nutrients you're trying to give to or provide to the plant, the amount of nutrients the bigger plant needs is the same, but the volume of soil that you're putting that in becomes smaller. So I can see where it's going to have to cycle it faster or be a lot more intensive.
There's no room for error in a 10 gallon pot when it comes to nutrition. Like you gotta be, and in my opinion, that's not a water only, you gotta be feeding like crazy. And so if anyway, I'm sure people would disagree with me. And I think that like any method can work, but in my experience, there's no way you would, the top dressing would first off be really thick and it'd be concentrated in the top. I'm all about top dressing. I top dress my plants in my garden, but it's really less precise and it's slower. It's not like a quick effect, right? Because it's the release of nutrients in something like fishbone meal or anything that ends in meal. It requires biological action. The biology needs to decompose or mineralize those amendments for the nutrients to release, and then they need to be through water. They need to move into the root system, and the biology is only going to mineralize those meals if there's moisture and warmth. And if it sits on the surface of the soil and it's not constantly warm, and it's getting blasted by HPS or whatever, it's just not, it's not as immediate. And that's why liquids have been traditionally, in my opinion, very effective in the cannabis industries, because they're immediate. So people see just immediate response. There's like a lag time to a top dress that I think it makes management tougher. But again, that's my style. So I'm all about top dressing, but I amend pretty deeply. I've always been I till my garden every year. And I have fantastic results. And I'm not, again, I think no-till is fantastic, but I'm kind of working my way up to that. I don't think it's necessary for really good quality and really high yields.
One of the, I guess, kind of roll into another question about top dressing is, so you mentioned some of them, like any of the meals, right? They need time and biology to work on them, but then there's other amendments like gypsum, or the sulfates, right? Like the gypsum, calcium sulfate or potassium sulfates are a powder. And if you're top dressing some of that in and watering that, those are becoming soluble right away, right? Like, is that more of an immediate response?
So that's a great follow-up. And I should have said that. Anything ending in meal, might take some time depending on the moisture and the warmth. And anything ending in sulfate is immediate. So you can, dissolving potassium sulfate in water and drenching your plants, which is an organic product. It's also used in conventional hydro, but it's soluble. up to 420 grams per gallon, easy number to remember. And so if you sprinkle it on if you top dress with it and then water it in and then drench it, it's the same exact thing. It's the same exact thing. Now, gypsum is calcium sulfate, and it's way less soluble, but it's the same thing. It's going to sort of, it's not going to technically dissolve, but it'll suspend in the water. A certain quantity will dissolve. It'll flow right into your root zone, especially if it's powdered, and you're giving it calcium and sulfate ions immediately. So that's a great point.
Yeah, I like that. And one of the questions, I guess, that's kind of for me kind of come on the radar is the topic of like soil density. And like, and especially when we're measuring like soil tests, like some of the soils fluffy and other soils are heavier. How big a role does that play in recommendations?
So I used to use bulk density because I was starting off with classic agronomic math that was based on topsoil, and they assume that an acre, a furrow slice is 2 million pounds, and the bulk density of a silt loam is like 1.22, and all the math is based on those assumptions. And when you change those assumptions in soilless media and you bring the bulk density like to 0.5, it changes everything by like an order, like by 2 or 3x. So I was essentially taking topsoil calculations and multiplying it by the bulk density difference and coming up with the new soil recommendation, which said that I should be applying at, 1/3 the rate. And so I used to really think about bulk density, and then I realized that those recommendations were not working. And they definitely wouldn't work with cannabis. It's just like intuitively, it's just tiny amounts. So I did this multi-year process of calibrating in soilless media where I'd apply 1 cup of alfalfa meal, and then I'd retest the soil and I'd see how much nitrogen it provided. And then I would do a cup of gypsum and I would retest the soil. I spent thousands of dollars testing and just going through every single organic amendment in different quantities and seeing how much it changed the nutrient levels, mostly in the soil solution on the paste test. So I stopped looking at bulk density. I just started looking at the evidence of what was actually like moving the needle and changing the numbers on the test. Now I think about, and then the other thing to think about is if you parts per million ppm, it's a concentration. So it doesn't really matter. It's a concentration in a certain amount of material. So the bulk density doesn't matter. Why bulk density does matter is not so much nutrient related, but physical. I mean, the physical characteristics of soil are arguably more important than the chemistry. And there's a book called, I'm looking at it right here, called Soilless Culture. It's a textbook and it's very dense. It's not an easy read. I haven't read the whole thing. But it goes into the physical characteristics of soilless media, and it is fascinating. There's ways to measure porosity and pore space and infiltration rate, and bulk density has a major impact. Particle size, so like different sized aggregate will change both the bulk density and the porosity. I mean, there's a whole world of like the physical components of soilless media that nobody's touched. And so bulk density matters, but not in nutrient recommendations, at least how I go about it.
Yeah, that's cool, man. I'd be curious to try to dig into something like that. If it sound like more like a textbook, you said, though, not really.
Yeah, and it was like, there's topics that I've got a bunch of textbooks, and some of them I'll read them cover to cover. Like I'm so into it. I'd say most of them, though, I open and I just can't get into it's like, I know it's important and it's pretty interesting, but it's not riveting. Like I'm not just like, and this is soilless culture is one of those in the latter category. It's like, I know it's important and I hope somebody tackles like going really, really deep into measuring and managing like, what size your pumice should be and how coarse your peat moss should be. And like, and how that changes after 10 cycles of reusing the soil. and how that influences the biological profile and the nutrient dynamics. Like somebody needs to do that. It's just not going to be me.
No, yeah. Well, that actually kind of was like part of my next question too, is so a lot of people are making these peat-based medias, you know, the traditional type Cornell mix, or what people call a Coots mix now or whatever, but
Yep.
the third, but you know, in a long use or long multi-cycle system like that, what would you really be seeing happening from the breakdown of that peat moss in that system? Is that releasing extra nutrient, like anything, or?
Well, so yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple things that I think about. The first, to go back to bulk density, the bulk density increases because those materials start really fluffy and the biology continues to break them down more and more. And it becomes, especially worms. I mean, every grow I've ever been in, like eventually if you're reusing your soil, the worms find their way in, and worms will essentially turn all of that media into castings, which is more dense than a fluffy, new mix. Obviously the aggregate doesn't go away, but the bulk density increases. So I sort of think about adding a little cocoa or a little more aggregate or a nice fluffy compost, something to actually, compost wouldn't be the answer, something to continue to sort of fluff out or decrease the bulk density of the soil. The second thing on reusing soil, what was the second point you brought up?
Just if it was releasing any nutrients.
Oh, right. So peat moss is essentially inert. So it doesn't contain any nutrients or, trace amounts, nothing that's going to affect anything. Because it's so inert, it has a low pH. So it has an acidifying effect. It's a light, acidifying effect, but it does over time will put downward pressure on your pH. Now, all of your other amendments and some teas and all the other inputs are usually putting upward pressure on the pH. So it totally cancels out that acidification effect of the peat. The compost is a more significant thing. So your compost component, whether that's vermicompost or castings or yard waste compost or whatever, your compost or composted manure source, as that breaks down and that gets mineralized over time, cycle after cycle, that's going to be constantly throwing nutrients into availability. And it's going to, so that'll really change your soil chemistry depending what's in your compost. So I work with growers who, I'm thinking of one specifically in Michigan, not going to name names, but unfortunately they got a batch of compost that was just really high in magnesium. And so it's like, even if they flush after the round, they flush out their available magnesium in the soil solution. Well, that compost, as it keeps breaking down, keeps pushing more and more magnesium. So it's kind of an uphill battle. So I guess the short answer is how the nutrition changes totally depends on the compost being used in the mix.
Wow, that's interesting. And because you were doing some of the tests for me, but we were just doing some of the well water testing, and we found pretty high levels of bicarbonate, and that the magnesium was out of balance to the calcium, and it was causing a buildup. So test after test, we were seeing that build up. But my main question here is there ever a point where you would say, hey, this magnesium buildup is to a point where it's going to take you so many crop cycles to get it back in balance, it's not worth it, it's worth just ditching the soil and restarting from anew? Or is that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I never make that recommendation, because that is a sort of holistic farm decision, and I don't have enough information to understand like the economics of like people's farms or home grows or whatever. So when I see a soil, I'm like, here's what you do. And then they get to choose, which, it might be helpful, I think, if I gave them a little bit of indication, like what's too far gone. But I kind of think that the plant health is what determines if it's too far gone. Like sometimes I see these wacky soils, and based on the environmental conditions and the strains, It's like sometimes strains can survive and thrive in some weird, environments. They tend to do better if the nutrient levels are better, but they can tolerate excesses. So yeah, I think that the soil can be too far gone. And by the way, I just pulled up your water test that you took in July, and your bicarbs were like 173 parts per million, which is definitely where I would say you want to acidify your water. But then, the magnesium was 21 parts per million, which doesn't sound like a lot, but the magnesium ion is big, and you don't need that much magnesium. I mean, just to give a little bit of context, if you took a tissue test, 5% of that leaf tissue is calcium, but like 0.5 or 0.4 is magnesium. So it's just, you don't, and it's also going to push out high magnesium is a real issue in cannabis production because it reduces the uptake of potassium and calcium, and excesses. And I have no idea why, but sometimes when magnesium is really excessive, the plant displays a magnesium deficiency where an Epsom salt foliar will actually like darken the leaves. So it's very counterintuitive, but something is happening that's kind of shutting down the system. So 21 ppm in your water, if you're using blue mats or some hyper efficient form of irrigation, that magnesium will just continue to build. If you're like overwatering or watering to runoff or past runoff, you might be able to just keep everything moving through your system. But then you've created almost this little hydro loop where you have to you're leaching everything. So you kind of have to feed more and leach more. And so in your case, I mean, and if again, I don't always recommend RO, but I mention it to people because it's expensive and there's a lot of wastewater. And if you're on 6 acres, there's no way you're going to RO your water.
Right.
But at 173 and 21, there's a bunch of magnesium bicarbonate. And that's like, you don't want that.
Yeah, the bicarbonate's the real kill-all right there, isn't it? That's the one that'll.
Yeah. I mean, bicarbonate will tie up all kinds of nutrients, and it's got that negative charge, so it can tie up micronutrients. It also it puts really, really strong upward pressure on your pH. So, and bicarbonates can build up in your soil, and it's just, I mean,
always battling it every round then, right? Like,
I mean, the reason bicarbonate to me is less of a big deal is you put acid in the water, and it neutralizes bicarbonate. It just slashes it. Something like sodium or magnesium, you can't acidify your way out of that. Once it's there, it's there. You can't like eliminate an element. So that's why like filtration is necessary, and filtration sucks oftentimes. Especially if you have a lot of volume of water that you need to filter. It's just like, it can suck. But in a small grow or in an indoor operation, like filtration can be a lifesaver.
So RO would probably be the most ideal recommended. I mean, that's definitely going to get, as far as getting everything out of the water, maybe it's not the most efficient, but because I don't know of any other way outside of like trying to, like you said, trying to acidify it or treat it, or just go straight RO.
Yeah, and I'm with you. I just don't know of another way. I'm not like a filter expert. Right. As far as I can tell, like my ears are wide open to like, if someone were to ever mention a filter that took just sodium out or just mag out or so, I would remember it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I see these issues every day. So I haven't in my light research and just in my experience and talking to people, I don't know of another option. RO is kind of like the atom bomb. It just takes everything out to the point of debatably taking too much out. It becomes, there's this measurement called Phc and Agronomy that essentially looks at your water's ability as like a solvent, because it's the universal solvent. So a perfectly clean water, a perfectly clean RO water will grab onto ions. Like it wants to pull ions into solution. So it can kind of, over time, it can start to like strip or mine your soil a little bit. not a big deal because you're amending every round, but over time it would leach all the nutrients out of your water or soil faster than a water that had a bunch of minerals in it. So this PHC, if it's high, it says that the water is actually going to be depositing minerals into your soil. So this water that you have has a high PHC. It would be over time, it would be depositing minerals. Once you RO that water, it works in the opposite way.
Got it. No, that makes sense. I mean, people have always kind of talked about the RO water in that way, like, oh, it's going to rob from the soil, but what you're talking about is if it's running all the way through, like if you're not watering the runoff, then
yeah,
can't leach anywhere, right? Like
totally. That's a great point. If anything, it's just pulling it into solution. And then, and then when that water evaporates off, it might precipitate but it's not leaving the pot. So.
Oh, that's cool. Because one of the, I guess I had a couple other follow-up ones.
Yeah, man.
Based on some of my tests, one of the questions that I've kind of run into is some of these recommendations, and we talked about it a little bit the last time, but like, I guess the one that pops into my head is the magnesium sulfate. They come in such small recommendations, and you're talking about like put them in water and then watering them in. What I'm wondering is there a conversion to go from that dry amendment recommendation to a liquid amendment? Because like companies like Advancing Eco Agriculture, for example, put out like their Rebound Manganese, which is a specialized like 12% manganese or whatever.
Right.
Is there kind of a conversion to figure out, well, how much should I water in versus trying to get a powder like what you're talking?
So, that's a great question. The short answer is yes. There's a conversion where like, yeah, I mean, I would essentially like the way to do that calculation would be to just try to find the weight of manganese going into your soil and by the way, manganese, not magnesium, which is tricky. The manganese is a micronutrient. I recommend it in like teaspoons per cubic yard of soil volume. Magnesium sulfate would be in like half a cup. But manganese, copper, zinc, boron, iron, those are all really small quantities because they're micronutrients. So with manganese, I would take the weight of manganese sulfate, and then I would take the weight of manganese being applied in that liquid.
Okay.
I'd compare them. The problem with that is manganese sulfate, even though it's very soluble, hits soil and most of it becomes immediately unavailable, which sounds horrible, but really it's very, very inexpensive. It's dirt cheap compared to any bottled branded manganese product. And so even if, a bunch of it in a high pH environment is not available, it's still a good deal. And so I don't ever write recommendations using branded like bottled nutrients, because there's just so many and they all have different quantities and it depends on how often you're feeding. It's complicated. And so I just stick with I'm sort of product agnostic and I stick to the raw ingredients. The other issue with something like John Kemp's products or any of these products is they're often chelated. So you often don't need a lot because they're hyper available. They're not going to change your soil chemistry much at all, but they're still going to find their way into the plant. So that's why I wouldn't actually ever do that math with a growing plant when you're doing like a live drench, is because it could be way too much, liquid manganese sulfate if it's chelated versus if it's just in the raw manganese sulfate form.
Yeah, that's what I found out. It can really quickly be way too much.
Yeah, definitely. Did you over apply like a liquid manganese or something?
Just yeah, as a one time kind of, and I saw the first signs of some phytotoxicity, and I was like, oh, I guess 10 milliliters per gallon is kind of a bit much of that one, so I might want to dial that back. But
And yeah,
it's live and learn on some of that stuff, and
it's also like they use manganese sulfate to get their manganese, but then there's probably like 5 to 10 other things in there that could be really like intense salts or just phytotoxicity. I mean, you just never know what the other things are doing. And I would never foliar apply. Are you talking a foliar or a drench?
it was a foliar, yeah.
Okay. So I would never foliar apply manganese sulfate. I would always drench it in the soil. If I wanted manganese and foliar, I would do like a organic amino chelated manganese from a company and that would be a branded product, something like Albion or Biomin, Albion metallocate or Biomin. Those are like these really high effective manganese foliars, similar to AEA's product, probably more affordable. And it's super effective. Like I'd say like most of the large commercial growers of tree fruit, I love orchards. I love cannabis and I love orchards. Very different, but both super cool. And all the organic orchards around here use Albion. And I've seen it work in sap analysis. I've seen it in tissue analysis. Like it works, but it's never going to change the actual like soil chemistry. Obviously, it's a foliar. But even if you applied it into the soil, like it wouldn't move the needle.
Yeah, it's just not that big. I was thinking there was some kind of an easy calculation because I've seen, so like for example, like a 10-10-10 and a dry powder, if you see that same company's liquid formula, oftentimes it's like 0.1, you know what I mean? 0.1,
Yeah.
0.1 kind of thing. So I thought maybe there'd be just kind of an easy conversion like that, but it sounds
no, because solubility matters and chelation matters, and and foliar versus soil applied matters. So no, there's not a simple calculation.
Got you. And that kind of rolls into my next question with the foliar treatment. So when you're like, when I'm doing I get your recommendations from you and I do my top dressing on the soil, along the way, I do periodic, foliar applications of different things, say aloe or seaweed or something along the way. But what I'm wondering is, how do those need to be taken into account for the total plant nutrition, so to speak, as far as like what I'm mixing into the soil as top dress, or is that kind of a minimal thing to where it's not really?
No, I don't think it matters. I mean, the approach I believe in is you amend your soil, and that's really what I help people with. And then you have a biological program, whatever that may be, whether it's just a inoculant or you're trying to do a compost extract or whatever it may be, or you're just using cultural practices and reusing your soil and building your populations, and then a foliar program where you're applying foliars that could be biostimulants, could be nutritional foliars, could be whatever. I mean, there's a million foliars, could be like a ferment. And so when it comes to nutrition, it's not going to really influence, they should be working together. Like the plant could and should be getting nutrients both from the soil and from the stomata through foliar. So what I help people do is just kind of guide them in their in what nutrient the plant needs. And it's kind of like hit the soil and hit the plant. That's sort of my belief. Like if your tissue test shows that you're low in, let's just keep using manganese. It's like I would drench manganese sulfate and I would hit it with a chelated manganese foliar also. Because if it's below the target level, it's reducing photosynthesis, which is going to be reducing yield. And so it's like, just slam it. But no, the amount of manganese applied to a foliar is not ultimately gonna, as long as you're using label rates and appropriate rates, it shouldn't affect anything happening down low.
that makes sense. So 'cause, I mean, just the uptake, I know, so you can really affect the plant, really quickly. Cause I know, like, as far as uptake, some of that stuff can be really potent, really fast in a
Oh yeah.
foliar.
Oh yeah.
For example, I said I made the mistake, but yeah, it was kind of, I don't know, an interesting thought I had. Am I doing too much by trying to add in the foliar? But I was thinking along the same line as you, as I'm trying to accentuate it. You know what I mean? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. There's like 4 R's, and one of them is the right rate, and the rate is critical. Right source, right placement, right time, but the rate is really a yeah. And that's the other thing on these bottled products. It's like I always just say label rate, because whoever made that product has burned plants, killed plants, seen
Yeah.
it work, not work, and so it's like just go with that. Now I've also worked with companies where their label rate it doesn't do shit, but that's just probably because the product is bad, Yeah. So anyway, I tend to like product companies that are a little older because they've seen the repetitions and they've seen the failures. It's not, it's not to say that like new products aren't good, but it's like you create the chemistry or whatever the product is, but it's nice to see 1,000 or 10,000 repetitions to know what the right rate is.
Some of what, honestly, what got me kind of thinking along that line of is some of the guys talking about, foliar applications of like a potassium silicate, for example. It's a real common one.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, maybe even once, twice a week. But the potassium is what was basically the topic of discussion there. Is that you're trying to get the silica from that, but you're actually getting quite a bit of potassium along with that mix. And I was kind of wondering if that would really throw the plant out of balance.
Okay, so yeah, I get what you're saying. So in a situation like that, if I'm like, it is very important for me to get silica in the plant. Like I want to be jamming silica and foliar, and that's the best which I do think that's one of the better silica products for foliar. I might back off a little bit on my potassium in my soil. Just so like, yeah, because if you have an excess in the soil and then you have to get it in the foliar, that's not ideal. But that's like true dialing. I mean, I would want to be looking at, I give potassium sulfate soil rates, which just get people in a generally healthy range. But the real way to do it is then to look at the tissue and be like, okay, where am I at on the tissue? Like what percent potassium? And that one's going to change. So it's like, I would love to see like 3% potassium in veg prior to flowering. And then as the plant relocates that potassium as it flowers, that rate, it's going to go down. So you'd want to see tissue every 2 weeks, and you'd want to see like, how quickly it drops, and does it ever drop below 2? If it ever drops below 2, then you need, regardless of what the soil levels are saying, you want more potassium. So I would look at tissue and I would determine what the right soil levels are. And but I mean, potassium in particular, how I generally think about it is obviously you can overdo it. You can overdo anything, but as long as your calcium is really high in veg, to me, you can really just hammer potassium in flower. So I wouldn't be, I guess the potassium silicate foliars would be happening in veg, right? Primarily.
Yeah. Cause I don't know. It wouldn't be doing it.
I mean, maybe like 1 or 2 weeks into flower, but yeah, I wouldn't want that. I wouldn't want that potassium if necessarily. And if I was doing potassium foliars in veg, I would want to be running my soil potassium pretty low. So I get what you're saying. And I think that's a worthwhile consideration with potassium.
But this topic of potassium kind of leads into the next questions too, because you had mentioned doing another soil test right before transition into flower, and I'm just wondering, like, that's kind of the way I've been doing that. So as I'm moving them into flower, I'm usually getting that recommendation, mixing it in, whatever, that first week. But are there any like strategies that I could maybe start implementing that? I guess the one I was thinking, so like for example, there was one tablespoon of potassium silicate on there, or whatever the example is. But am I better off waiting till like the second week of flower to apply that, since it's going to be kind of readily available? Because where the question's coming from is, I heard a discussion and they were talking about applying potassium too early in that transition of flower can actually stifle your yields at the end result as well. So I'm just kind of wondering if there's a strategy for that transition period in flower.
Yeah. So if potassium is really low, like deficiently low, and it's slowing down photosynthesis, you want to apply it right then. So there's a certain level on a soil test where I say you need potassium, right? Like you need it no matter what. Even if you're in veg, you should put potassium down. And then there's another level where it's like, no, this is a good, healthy level, but you're going to want more in flower. And so oftentimes my recommendations, I'm looking at one right now, it says 1.26 cups of potassium sulfate. Apply half now, half during flower. So that person is like low and they need more in veg, straight up. But sometimes it says, 0.4 cups of potassium sulfate, and it says apply in flower. Because it's like, you're good now, but you're going to want more in flower. In terms of the timing, I should be more specific, because anecdotally, what I've heard several times is that you want your potassium after stretch. Like you want it, or you can't really affect. I've also seen that you can't really affect it too late. Like if you're hammering potassium way late into flower, like it's not really going to do much for you. But you also don't want it too early. You want it like once it starts stacking, like 2 weeks into flower, is perfect. Or whenever you feel like, yeah, exactly. But you don't want to wait too long. That's when you really want to hammer it, because if you're 6 weeks in, it's like, it's not going to move the needle much, in my opinion.
And kind of another conundrum, I guess, that has always kind of perplexed me is I know like in flower formation, the plants generally like a higher level of potassium, but I also was listening to another discussion and they were talking about how potassium is not actually like formed into any, plant material at all. So like it just kind of, why would it need an elevated level of potassium for flower formation if it's not even using that? You know what I'm saying? Like,
well, it's definitely using it.
Okay.
And pretty much across all crop types and probably across all species, seed formation and fruit formation, and in this case, flower formation, require, it's a huge potassium draw. I mean, in apple production, like to fill an apple, you need a ton of potassium. And so potassium is used. My physiology, I've studied each nutrient and what it does in plants, and they're all what I would say like ubiquitous. Like they all have so many functions. Besides like molybdenum, which has one function, potassium's doing so many different things. It's opening and closing stomata, and so I couldn't explain. I don't remember the pathway exactly of how it's forming fruit, seeds, and flowers, but it is, and it's super important in that metabolic process. But it's a good question. I should research it more. I'll get back to.
I was just always thinking that, because I know, like, there's discussions, like you said, it does certain things like controlling the mata and controlling water flow.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it just was always like, well, why does it need an elevated? Because you'd think it's forming flowers, so something like calcium would make sense. It's using that in every cell wall that it's building, but why? Like, it always kind of perplexed me why we would have to elevate that during flower. Because
it's a great question. I'm referencing, so there's like a few different books that I would recommend to answer this question. One is Plant Analysis Handbook 4, The other would be, well, Mineral Nutrition of Higher Plants is the Bible. It is like an extraordinary book. It has the most detail of any textbook I've ever seen when it comes to nutrition. And it's thick and it's like a reference thing, but you could look at the chapter on potassium, which is going to be like 150 pages. But it's got like subheading and it's pretty easy to navigate, and you could get that answered pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's fine. And I'll dig into that. It's just one of my own kind of questions, because the other side of that is, in a lot of the bloom boosters or whatever out on the market, they're often, they have the phosphorus boost and the potassium boost. And it just kind of made me wonder, like, is that part of your thought on phosphorus too? Is that should be kind of elevating through the flower stage, or?
That one makes less sense to me. So when I think the reason I'm like totally into potassium and flowering is because, again, it's consistent across all crop types. It's like, yeah, when you're filling fruit or flower, like, you need potassium, period. Phosphorus is anecdotally, I hear that people get just better, larger, tighter, heavier buds pushing phosphorus in flower. But I don't take that at face value, because it could be that they were low in phosphorus through veg too, So I think phosphorus, how I think about phosphorus as a nutrient, as just such a critical nutrient, is it's sort of the like energy money of the cell. And I think I want it high in veg too. It's like, yeah, I want it high and I hate saying that because it can be so overused and it's like the worst pollution problem. But I think high phosphorus is great. Especially high, like, available phosphorus, whether that's from really good biological cycling or a phosphorus solubilizing bacteria, or running your phosphorus high. Synthetically, you could do phosphoric acid, or there's so many different liquid soluble phosphorus products. So the issue, I think, in organic production is we don't have very many soluble sources of phosphorus. There's like soft rock phosphate, and it's really not very soluble. Like, organic growers are using soft rock phosphate, and synthetic growers are using like phosphoric acid or monoammonium phosphate, or outdoors like triple superphos. It is night and day between the solubility of those two products. And so I think what happens in organic systems is there's just not enough available phosphorus all the way through the entire cycle. And there's not a good way to get that phosphorus. There's not like a truly OMRI certified liquid phosphorus. I mean, there's a high phosphorus fish. There's like a soft rock phosphate that's kind of suspended, but there's not like good. So I tend to think that, yeah, you should push phosphorus in flower, but you should also keep it pretty available and high in veg. And if you keep it high in veg, the plant uptakes plenty, and then it's very mobile. So again, it'll move it from the leaves into the flower, and you'll have more than enough. And you don't need to like push it with these like crazy flower liquid products. But those liquid products are going to have a really positive effect if you don't have enough to begin with.
Yeah, because that was my thought on it too. It's, phosphorus is ATP. That's the energy source of everything that it's making. It's like everything. Yeah, it's where the products of photosynthesis are getting used up on. So it's kind of
the other thing I think about is like, why does it work better in flower? Like, why is it in these flower formulations? Well, part of it is because the plant is so big. There's that many more cells that need that energy for metabolism. That the thing about cannabis is like the nutrient requirement is higher because the plant is so much bigger, and all of a sudden it's trying to make these huge flowers. So the energy, think about like how much a baby needs to eat versus like a giant bodybuilder. It's just a different beast. And so I think there's a little bit of that where it's like plants get hungry, so they like soluble phosphorus.
No, yeah, that's a good point. Cause even I guess on one of the other talks they were discussing light saturation and how, like, you know, plants are gonna actually burn through energy faster on growth and under heavy light saturation versus trying to make the sugars into amino acids kind of thing. So it was
Yeah.
where, yeah, you're at, you'd actually think it would be producing more sugar because of the more light, but it's actually taken away because it's got to burn it through the other process of
Yeah, no, absolutely,
or whatever.
that's fascinating. I mean, that's a whole other world that, again, someone needs to tackle. Well, there's another good book. Oh, where is it? It's essentially the interplay between all of the different factors of photosynthesis. So light, CO2, oxygen, water, and nutrients, and how, like, when you pull one, you know, how it changes all the others.
Yeah.
It's called Plant Empowerment. And I just received it in the mail. But as soon as I opened it, I was like, oh, this is gold. Again, very technical, but like for someone who wants to perfect greenhouse growing or indoor environment, like really controlled environment, the Dutch in the Netherlands, they're the best. Like one of the best agricultural universities is in the Netherlands. I can't even pronounce the name of it, but their country's tiny and they have to produce a bunch of food. And so they're like have super optimized in these like hydro greenhouses, which on the one hand, it's not really my style of growing, but they're so good at it.
And it's so cool.
It's super cool. I mean, they're like flower production and like the highest yields in like tomatoes and cucumbers and just greenhouse production is from. And so anyway, 3 of these Dutch guys wrote this book, Plant Empowerment. And it's like kind of it's just an interesting way to think about it. Like they talk about energy flows in the plant. Which is, yeah, it's just, I shouldn't even talk about it because I just received it.
Read it or whatever.
Yeah.
No, that's a great, I love you dropping the different books to read, because I know, like, I'm not the only one. There's plenty of people in chat that'll check them out too and try to dive deeper into it. And
I will say all the books I've mentioned are like true textbooks, like really dense, you know, $150, $200, $300. So, yeah, I mean, just a heads up. Some of them are, I mean, the short, easy reads are great, but they're almost like tougher to find. Like I started with a bunch of books like The Art of Balancing Soil Nutrients or The Intelligent Gardener. That's a really popular one. Teaming with microbes, teaming with nutrients, etc. But then the more I learned from the textbooks, the more I'm like, no, that's super incomplete. And that's just like one person's perspective, which is cool, but it's not. The problem with those books is that you read one of these books and you're like, oh, this is how it works. It's like, well, not really. That's how one person sort of researched it and presented it. The reason textbooks are cool, even though they're such a hassle and a nightmare to read, is because they're just pulling from like thousands of studies and like the general consensus around how things work, not just one person. So anyway, I love Hands-on Agronomy by Neil Kinsey. These are all like very formative books to me. But at this point, I'd rather read like 2 pages of a textbook than like 40 pages of
somebody's opinion.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, because a lot of times that's there's, I don't know, I guess back and forth on different well, this person says it this way and this person says it this way, where it's, you know, it could be just one person's in this type of soil and that's why or whatever, you know, there's just different reasons.
My biggest fear is like everyone, you know, reads and then everyone kind of repeats it and everyone's telling their friends and they're telling their friends and it becomes like that's how it is. And it's like it's amazing how that can become the paradigm, and you know, for 10 years or something.
Right. Yeah.
So like I'm in this phase of my like gardening, farming life where I especially this year, I just started questioning everything. like rock dust, right? I've always used rock dust. And it's like, kelp meal, like everything. I'm like, how do we know? Like, how do we know foliars work? Like, how do we know which foliars work? And I've just started questioning everything. Which, I've come back to like believing in everything as well. But I think it's important to also just question information that's being circulated just because everyone's saying it. I start questioning teas. Like, I actually still believe this about compost tea, any brewed tea. Obviously, you're cultivating billions of microorganisms, and you can change it, right? You can go from bacterial to fungal, depending on the feed source and everything. And so you're when you drench a tea, you're obviously drenching biology, but you're also drenching a shit ton of nutrients. Like, I've tested teas, I've sent in teas for a nutrient analysis, and they're often stronger than like a hydro recipe, like in certain areas. And so that's a great one where it's like everyone thinks about like, oh, you do this for biology, but nobody's thinking about the nutrients. And I'm sure that the reverse happens, right? Like I look at compost. I just applied 10 tons per acre of a composted poultry manure. And so I got like 30 tons over 3 acres. And, there's the farmers who apply that around here, they're only thinking about the nitrogen, right? And it's like, no, there's so much more to that story than just nitrogen. So it's like we get sort of this tunnel vision of what we see or what we hear, and that becomes our reality. And then we're blind to so much of what's happening.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm guilty too, for sure. And I'm kind of intentionally guilty. Like I only focus on nutrition because I want to be really like the best at this one narrow thing. And then, ideally there's 100 people who are the best in all these categories. And then we have this really wonderful, like diverse, education. And then people can grow better plants.
Yeah, man. No, it is cool. And I do appreciate that, all the different people that are, like you say, specialize in different things. Because, even though, certain people may disagree or say something a little different, you can take something from everybody too,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then nobody's got the whole pie, so to speak. Everybody's giving a piece.
I also think there's something to like feeding, everyone has a different style. Like I do a garden tour around with my friends around where I live, and there's like 4 or 5 of us, and we just go look at each other's plants and like hang out. And it's all cannabis. There's some veggies, some people have other stuff, and I love it because everyone has a different style, like a unique. It's almost like your style of clothing or your style of hair, whatever. Like gardening, you cultivate your own unique way of doing things. And so I think it's super cool when when individual growers gravitate toward something that they're more interested in. Like I've just noticed that some of my friends, they like want to create ferments and like crazy potions and concoctions, and like, it's sweet. And like their garden reflects it, and everything it's like, and I just think that for me, cannabis production and probably for most people listening, like it's a lifelong thing. So to sort of feed the passion through whatever is like catching your interest is super important. And so in a sense, like getting the whole picture isn't even the goal. The goal is just to like nerd out and get really excited about whatever it is that makes you excited, and that continues the hobby.
Exactly. Yeah, it kind of keeps you down the rabbit hole, and
their
turn to take, and
it's addicting.
It is a little bit, man. It's kind of funny. I know a lot of new growers get that too, where they're like, oh my gosh, it's so overwhelming. And, and you almost kind of hit that wall where you're like, I don't want to know everything. But then it's like, the more you grow, the more things you run into. And it's like, you got to figure out this hurdle. And then it causes you to learn more about whatever, and certain things you pick up a piece of information, and it lights a light bulb in your head, like, oh, that fucking makes sense totally of everything now. Like,
exactly. It's like you're piecing it all together. Yeah, and
But
my
it is,
style of gardening has changed over the years. Just like, and it's not only because of what I've learned, but it's just, I don't know, it's a reflection of me. It's like a reflection of how I want things to look. It's a reflection of like where I'm at in my life. If it's easier to do it one way or,
yeah.
so anyway, I like for a while I was really into trellising. Like I was just so into trellising. And then I went in the opposite direction, just stuff like that.
Just let them go wild and not worry about it. And
Yeah, just like, tired of scrog, just tired of this. This is like, I'm not maximizing every square foot. So it's like, I always grow it outdoors. So I just get big cages. I put them in place early in the season and there's like multiple rings that go around the plants. It's kind of an old school style of growing, just big plants, minimal feeding, just really healthy soil biology and fairly water only. I don't foliar, but I get great. And I know that I could probably get a little extra boost, but it's not part of my style right now.
right, no, and if you don't need to, I mean, yeah, I've seen some pretty phenomenal results outside with minimal efforts. You know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
cool.
totally. Of course, controlled environment. I mean, here's something else. Like I used to be like real. I just didn't really like indoor growing, and more like, oh, I just want an indoor facility to run R&D projects on. Unfortunately, I have no time for that. I'm working on so many other people's indoor facilities, but I think that the controlled environment thing is such a cool opportunity.
Yeah, well, for what you're looking at, you can kind of nerd out and see different aspects by, like you can control CO2 level or temperature,
Absolutely.
humidity, take some
Absolutely.
of them variables away and see what actually might have happened in that. So
I've also love automation. So I'm really all about, what's that new product? Arroya. It's expensive and it's like, but just the idea of being able to monitor soil moisture and nutrient levels, so pH, EC, you're taking soil tests, you've got tissue tests, you have CO2, light intensity. I mean, you have like being able for me to have that entire data set is really cool because that's what leads to, I could take my understanding of nutrient management and I could improve it dramatically if I had a huge data set like that. Because you're right, you pull different strings. You increase light intensity, you increase dryback times. Like it changes the nutrient uptake, and that to me is like a whole other layer that we're going to get to at some point.
yeah, that was actually one question I had down here, was about that. If you had certain watering strategies, if you were doing allowing for any drybacks or a steady water.
So in general, I think that really good consistent soil moisture tends to be the winning approach until when you want your plant to be in like a vegetative state. When you want a more generative state, you want it to stop stretching and start stacking, and I think that larger drybacks is a good idea. I think that is a trigger to the plant to put it into a more reproductive state. And that's, again, consistent across multiple crop types. I don't believe in drybacks that are really significant. I think like subtle drybacks are what's important. Because if they're significant, you change the nutrient dynamics dramatically, because most nutrients are only available when there's water available to uptake. They move through mass flow or diffusion in soil moisture. Some nutrients are uptaken through what's called interceptive root growth. So copper, for example, the root has to literally grow into it and like hit its head on the copper to uptake it. But other nutrients have to be actually moved through the soil water. Calcium is a great example too, where like if you dry back too hard, you reduce your calcium uptake dramatically. I see this on, tomatoes. Like people get blossom end rot because their drybacks are too extreme and the calcium uptake suffers. So yeah, oftentimes like when I see calcium, like there's actually not the greatest correlation between calcium on a soil test, even a paste test, and in the plant tissue. I mean, the correlation is there, but it's not as strong as I would like it to be. And the reason is because of moisture and VPD. Like VPD has a way bigger effect on calcium uptake than the amount of calcium in the soil. So anyway, I don't know where the original question was. Oh yeah, watering technique. The other thing I'll say is that I think irrigation technique matters. Like it should be priority number one. Like irrigation is super important. And that's why blue mats have become so popular, is it really helps growers maintain consistent moisture. It's automatic. It's fairly low tech, even though I think that it's pretty expensive. It's also somewhat affordable. It's not an Arroyo system. And they work.
Yeah.
Because they, but in a perfect world, I'd take that little carrot knob and turn it a little bit to the right. Problem is, once you start messing with, in my experience, when I start messing with those blue mats, it's hard to get them back. Like you get runaways, they either dry out dramatically or they're, there's water running out of your beds.
Yeah.
Like that thing it's such a fine adjustment.
It can be, for sure. And it matters too if there's like you said, if it ran dry, the blue mat can get a little bit of air in there. And then it's not responding as quickly or as the same. And
you get a runaway. Like sometimes if they get air in them, you get a runaway and it just goes,
Yeah, I have an endless water supply to mine, so I've had the pleasure of the walking into the river flowing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in a perfect world, I'd have a automated volumetric soil moisture with an automated tensiometer connected to the cloud, and I would program it so it automatically turns on and off a solenoid valve in my irrigation system, and I would have drip. This is what I'm going to do for the farm, but for cannabis, it's way too much for cannabis production. But it'd be sweet.
Are those tensiometers that reliable? Like you would set your whole system up to that?
So let me think about this. I would use the volumetric moisture meter to turn on the system. And then as soon as the tensiometer hits 0, the tensiometer just shows you when your soil's wet, and that turns it off.
Okay. So it's like an on-off thing versus.
Yeah. I hope I have that right. It's late, man. I'm like not thinking.
You're good. Yeah. Oh, it is late. I didn't even realize. Yeah,
because they're measuring different things. So let me just talk it out loud. The volumetric soil is measuring volume of pore space filled with water. Tensiometer is measuring water tension, or the amount of energy it takes for roots to actually pull water, how available it is. Yeah. So if you use maybe I had it in reverse. If you use a tensiometer and it says, okay, turn on the irrigation, because I'm at like 100 millibars or whatever. How do you know when to turn that irrigation off or how much water to apply? And that's where the tensiometer. So when the tensiometer hits 0, that's when you turn it off. The volumetric moisture meter is going to determine where you turn it on, at what percent pore space filled with water. Does that make sense? That was kind of.
It does, because it does make sense that you would have to monitor it two ways, because that's kind of what I was getting at. Like a lot of I don't know if there's a preferred way to measure like moisture in a soil, like in a pot or whatever, because I've kind of messed around with a few different ones, and the Blue Mott digital one, to me, maybe it's trustworthy, but to me it just seems like that thing don't read the same every time, and it's
I don't like its battery, I didn't love that one either. I messed around with that for a season, and I don't know. I like that it was mobile, but it's like, if I'm going to be moving it from pot to pot, I'd rather be using like a nice volumetric probe, where I'm getting like multiple. But here's the other thing, that another theory of mine, and part of the reason it might have been inconsistent, is the soilless media isn't perfectly homogeneous. Like you get weird wet pockets and dry pockets, and like you can see that. I have this nice like $400. I don't know where it is. It's by it's a probe, and you put it in your soil.
That's
And
the
it's,
pulse one.
yeah, the pulse meter. I have this pulse meter, and it's shocking the difference in water content in one pot.
Really?
And I think it's accurate. I think it's showing, like, I mean, for example, like if it's right up against a big piece of pumice, it's going to be like an air gap. It's not going to be very wet, you know. So I just think that, like, it's not as homogeneous as topsoil, because there's these big particle sizes, and you get wet pockets and dry. And then obviously, if your soil ever goes hydrophobic, like, then you've got a serious issue. I grew in a 200-gallon pot last year, and there was some hydrophobic soil in the beginning of the season, but I just drenched this pot. Before I planted, I left the water on for like 4 days, put the plant in, the plant does great. I dump the pot out at the end of the season, and there was still a hydrophobic, like probably 10 gallons of soil at the bottom of the pot that had never seen water that whole season. They had remained hydrophobic the entire season. So anyway, I think that phenomenon happens, but in like very small little pockets of soil. And that's why you might be getting inconsistent readings. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that makes sense too. And that's probably like, is there anything to try to combat that if you do get, like, say, hydrophobic, with like an aloe help or something?
Yeah, I mean, a surfactant will help. So like a very strong surfactant would be like soap, but no one wants to put soap in their soil. So aloe is a common one. But honestly, like, it's not a great solution. I've drenched my hydrophobic soil with aloe, a lot of it, and it didn't do anything. I think the key is little bits of water constantly, like little pulses, and it starts to set in. I mean, I have a bunch of hydrophobic soil. I let it sit out in the desert for like a year. And I just spread it over the ground like an inch thick. And I turn the sprinkler on it every few days, and I let precipitation get it, and I'm going to mulch it, and over the course of the winter, it'll self-correct. But if I was a commercial grower, or even if I was a home grower, I'd put it in my garden or outside, and that's when I would replace my soil, honestly.
Let it rain a few times on it or something.
Yeah, for sure. You definitely don't want to try to like reclaim it in a day or something.
No, I like how you highlight how big of an issue that is, because that's something too that I guess, as learning to grow, you hear about people talk about that hydrophobic or whatever, and you don't really realize, but like what you just said, you tore that pot down and you didn't, what I mean, a good section of that was never even seeing water, and it's kind of eye-opening, because that good section of that won't see roots either.
No, we won't see no, absolutely, and that's a lot of soil volume.
Yep.
So, and a 200-gallon pot, whatever. Can you imagine if you're in a 15-gallon or 20-gallon or 30? I mean, it's like the difference between success and failure, really.
Yeah. So, hey man, we're coming up on an hour and a half. I did have a little other question, but I don't know how you're doing on time. I know it's
let's do one more. Does that work?
Yeah, that'll work. Mine was on manure. So as people are out kind of gathering up manures for compost piles, what precautions, or is there any kind of testing they should do before using random farm manures?
Definitely. Manure differs wildly. Like, no single input varies as much as manure, like nothing. And so the worst thing that could happen is there's a class of persistent herbicides. God, man, I'm struggling to remember names, but it doesn't really matter. Oh, clopyralil. Yeah, it's COLP, YRALID. So clopyralid herbicide damage. So in a lot of manures and compost, you can get this class of herbicides that persists for a really long time and will just toast your plants, make them look super weird. The easiest test is to plant peas, before you're going to use any compost or manure. You should just mix it with some peat perlite or whatever. Plant some pea seeds and make sure that the pea shoots germinate and grow without looking totally shriveled up.
Nice.
That's a really simple test for all compost and manure if you're not totally sure of how people have been dealing with it. With manure though, I would do a nutrient analysis. You can go on my website, you can get a new compost analysis. It costs $70, but it's a really high quality analysis. And I actually do a free recommendation on it. I'd be looking at pH. I'd be looking at total salts. I'd be looking at sodium. With manure, yeah, I mean, I look at everything. I look at nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. Most of that, yeah, it differs based on how the manure has been treated. Like if it's been left outside and composted or leached at all in a humid environment. It has to do with what the animal is eating. And there's certain things that I would be watching out for, mostly salts. Salts are so indicative of like how concentrated it is. And if there's just any numbers that are really, really high, that's what I'd be focused on. I wouldn't apply fresh manure. I'd compost it for cannabis production, which is what you're talking about. And I would just say like chicken manure is going to be by far the hottest, most nutrient rich. And like something like a horse manure is going to be on the opposite end of the spectrum, like not even close from a nutrient standpoint. But a bean or a pea assay is and beans are super salt sensitive. So if you plant not straight into the manure, mix it with something else, peas and beans, and they grow well, then I'd say that like, without spending the $70, that's a great little test.
Yeah, no, dude, that's a great gold nugget right there to end it with. I like that.
Yeah. Well,
That's
thanks for the
questions.
questions.
Because yeah, like you say, if there's a problem, it's going to show up in this other soft plant, so.
Absolutely. Yeah. You find these little sensitive plants and it's called a bioassay and they work super well. Like universities use it.
That's cool. No, that's great tip. So awesome, man. Yeah, I appreciate you taking the amount of time. I guess before we go, one other thing. I do know you got that online course. I don't know if you want to plug any of that or
yeah, sure. I'll plug the course. So I launched a course, Become a Cannabis Soil Expert. It's like 10 hours. It's 10 hours of self-guided video content that goes really, really deep into soil and crop nutrition for cannabis. So how to mix your own soil, how to amend it. I go through every single organic input that, again, these raw mineral products, and talk about those in detail. I talk about how to manage nutrition in season. So how to top dress and foliar, how to manage your liquid feeds. And then there's a section on advanced techniques. And then I'm about to add another module. Depends on when this baby comes, to be honest, and it's going to be on outdoor production in topsoil, which is managed. So the entire course is really on soilless media. But the next module is going to be topsoil. So like true mineral, sand, silt, and clay soils outside. And I've gotten very positive feedback. I was kind of nervous to release it. One, I just spilled the beans on everything I know and everything I've learned looking at like 10,000 soil tests for cannabis over the last several years and working with hundreds of growers. So I was kind of like, should I be sharing everything? And I decided absolutely. That's kind of the law of the universe, right? Like share. So I put it all out there. And then the other reason is I was like, is this going to be good? And the feedback has been super positive. I think, a couple hundred people have gone through it and really enjoyed it. So anyway, if anyone's interested, you can access it through my website, and I'd love to have people on board.
That's cool. And you said something before we went live that I thought was really cool, is that you can kind of work through that at any pace you like. It's kind of like you got your access to it. And even as you add things, you'll have access to that too for the same kind of sign up fee or whatever. So
yeah, and I keep adding, and I'm going to change a bunch of things. Like I've learned so much this year. I'm going to like tweak targets. And so it's sort of like the cutting edge information that's going to be constantly updated. And the idea being that, lifetime access, and it's just going to keep getting better. So it's sort of a membership in a way. And yeah, it's also because it's 10 hours, not everyone has that time. So some people will log in just to look at like trichoderma or to learn more about alfalfa meal or whatever, just single topics at a time that they're interested in.
That's cool. Awesome, man. Well, with that, yeah, we've been some of the people in chat been putting up here on Instagram as Soil Doctor and stuff like that too. So I'll let you jump out and yeah, hopefully everything goes well with the baby here coming up. And
yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, be well. I'll look for your next tests and we'll be in touch offline.
Awesome, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. So,
thanks for the questions.
Yeah, definitely. I hope everybody grabs some notes there. And man, Brian's awesome. It's he's a wealth of knowledge. And yeah, I haven't signed up for that course, but it's definitely been in the back of my head too, because I'm kind of feeling guilty because I know like a lot of the questions I was asking him tonight are actually in his course and covered in depth in that. So most definitely, I got a lot of notes from it, and definitely hope everybody else picked up a thing or two. If not, there's a few books recommended to read too. So, but yeah, that's the close of the organic takeover. Probably give us a few minutes here, and we might get the weed nerd world going, or the old wormhole or rabbit hole before that. It's kind of changed names, but anyway, man, it's been a great time talking with Bryant. I really I have seen chat going by. I'm sorry I didn't type in it and try to stay focused on keeping the conversation going, but I definitely appreciate all the love and support, everybody that was you know, kind of promoting the show tonight on Instagram and stuff. I appreciate that. And this definitely makes it a cool opportunity for me to have a chance to talk with some of these people one-on-one that I, you know, probably wouldn't be able to get these insights from otherwise. So yeah, I definitely appreciate that opportunity that Eagle Gardens allows me to do this once a month on his channel. And so shout out to Eagle and all the work he's always putting into and keeping stuff going and giving us a little outlet to hang out in. So yeah, I hope everybody has a great Halloween and a great rest of their October. And we'll be back here, yeah, in middle of November, probably with Thanksgiving there. I'll probably do it a little early like this one. So with that though, I'm going to sign